Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover the untold story of Wu Zetian, a concubine who outlasted emperors, rewrote history, and ruled an empire that refused to believe a woman could. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the weight of the day begin to settle slowly, the way dust settles after a long journey. Feel the surface beneath you. The warmth of it. The stillness. Somewhere, very far away in time, a young girl is learning to read in a candlelit room in a city that no longer exists. She does not yet know what she will become. She only knows the pleasure of words, the texture of silk, the smell of ink. Tonight, we travel to that room. To that city. To the Tang dynasty of China, a civilization so vast and so luminous it was once called the center of the world. And we follow, quietly, the life of the one person in all of Chinese history who did what no woman had ever done before, and no woman would ever do again. Her name was Wu Zetian. And this is her story. Part 1, A World of Silk and Ceremony, the Tang Dynasty and its Age. Imagine, for a moment, a city so large that all of Rome at its greatest height could have fit inside just one of its outer wards. This was Chang'an, the imperial capital of the Tang Dynasty, in the year 630, roughly, when the empire was young and burning with ambition. Chang'an sat on a broad, flat plain in the Wei River valley of northern China, surrounded by mountains to the south and dry yellow loess hills to the north. The city was laid out like a chessboard, its streets running in long straight lines from gate to gate, its neighborhoods organized by function and by social rank. There were markets where merchants from Persia and Arabia traded silk and spices alongside Chinese cloth dyers and lacquerware artisans. There were Buddhist monasteries and Taoist temples standing within a few streets of each other. There were foreign embassies, polo grounds, gardens planted with rare trees brought from the far corners of the known world. The smell of Chang'an was the smell of an empire at its peak. Wood smoke in the mornings, drifting over tiled rooftops. The sharp sweetness of incense rising from temple courtyards. The heavy, musty perfume of the horse stables near the palace. And underneath all of it, always, the green and watery smell of the irrigated fields just beyond the walls, where farmers were already at work before the sun had fully risen. The Tang dynasty had been founded in 618, when a military general named Li Yuan, a man of mixed Chinese and perhaps Central Asian ancestry, overthrew the short-lived Sui dynasty and declared himself emperor, taking the name Emperor Gaozu. His son, the man who would become Emperor Taizong, consolidated the dynasty's power through a combination of military brilliance and administrative reform that set the tone for everything that followed. Emperor Taizong, whose personal name was Li Shimin, is remembered in Chinese history as one of the greatest rulers the country ever produced. He expanded the empire's borders westward into Central Asia, northward against the Turkic nomads, and eastward toward the Korean peninsula. He reformed the civil service, reducing the power of the old aristocracy and creating a more meritocratic system where talented men could rise through written examinations rather than purely through birth. He encouraged debate among his ministers, reportedly saying that a ruler who listened only to flattery was like a man who polished a mirror only on one side. And it was into this world, this glittering, expanding, confident world of the early Tang, that a girl named Wu was born. She was born around the year 624, though the exact date is uncertain. Her father, Wu Shihua, was a successful timber merchant who had aided Li Yuan in the founding of the dynasty and had been rewarded with official titles and social advancement. Her mother came from the Yang family, one of the great noble houses that had survived the transition between the Sui and Tang dynasties. Wu Zetian was, in other words, a girl of considerable social standing, but not of the very highest nobility. She was educated, prosperous, and positioned just close enough to the center of power to feel its gravity. In the Tang dynasty, girls of good families were expected to learn several things: the classic texts of Confucian propriety, the arts of music and dance, the management of a household, and the subtle social performances required to navigate a world in which women's lives were almost entirely governed by the men around them. A woman moved from her father's authority to her husband's authority to, in widowhood, her son's authority. She was expected to be virtuous, submissive, educated enough to be an interesting companion but not so educated as to challenge the established order. Wu, by all accounts, was educated far beyond what convention expected. Her father recognized something in her early: a sharpness of mind, a quality of attention, a way of reading a room that went beyond ordinary intelligence. He taught her to read not just the approved Confucian texts but history, literature, music theory. He brought her into conversations with his adult guests rather than keeping her strictly in the inner women's quarters. He treated her, in some respects, more like a son than a daughter, which in the world of Tang China was both an unusual kindness and an inadvertent act of radical significance. By the time she was 13 or 14, Wu was already remarkable. Her beauty was noted, but so was something else, a quality that observers described as presence, or self-possession. In a world where women were trained to be invisible in public spaces, Wu had a way of being noticed without apparently trying to be. And so it was that around the year 637 or 638, when Wu was approximately 13 years old, she was summoned to the imperial court. Emperor Taizong was assembling his inner palace, the harem of consorts, ladies-in-waiting, and attendants who served the imperial household. The selection of palace women was both a political and aesthetic exercise. Families of good standing sent their daughters as a sign of loyalty and as an opportunity for social advancement. A woman who caught the emperor's eye might rise. A woman who served at court and eventually retired from it carried the prestige of imperial association for the rest of her life. Wu was brought to Chang'an. She entered the forbidden precincts of the imperial palace, through gates that most people in the empire would never see, into a world of extraordinary refinement and extraordinary constraint. She was given the rank of Karanu, a fifth-tier imperial consort, the lowest of the formal designations for women in the inner palace. She was 14 years old. She would remain in that palace for the next 14 years. And in that time, watching, listening, waiting, something in her would be quietly and irreversibly transformed. Part 2. Inside the Forbidden Palace, the Years of Waiting. There is something about waiting that changes a person. Not the kind of impatient waiting that drums its fingers and checks the hour. But the long, quiet kind, the kind that has no clear end in sight, that requires you to make a kind of peace with uncertainty, that forces you to find meaning in small things because the large things are entirely out of your hands. Wu Zetian waited for 14 years inside the imperial palace of the Tang dynasty. And in that time, she did not simply endure. She observed. She learned. She cultivated herself in ways that would only become visible much, much later, when the opportunity finally came. The inner palace of the Tang Emperor was a city within a city. It occupied the northern portion of Chang'an's imperial complex, a vast area of gardens, pavilions, ceremonial halls, and private residences arranged around courtyards filled with the sound of water and the movement of wind through carefully pruned trees. Hundreds of women lived here, attended by thousands of eunuch servants and female officials who managed the complicated social hierarchy of the inner quarters. A woman's position within this hierarchy was determined by the emperor's attention or lack of it. The highest-ranking consorts had their own residences, their own staff, their own small economies of influence. Women of lower rank lived in more modest quarters and waited for the possibility of being summoned. Younger, newly arrived women were observed and evaluated. Some rose quickly. Others spent years invisible. Wu, at 14, was young and clever and beautiful enough to be noticed. But she was also, by the formal hierarchy, quite low-ranked. Her title, Karanu, carried with it a kind of undifferentiated servitude. She was present, she was available, she might be summoned, but she had no particular claim on the emperor's attention. What we know about her years in Taizong's court comes mostly from later sources, some of which are frankly hostile to her, and some of which have clearly been shaped by the legend that grew up around her after she rose to power. There are stories, anecdotes, really, that may or may not be reliable, but that have been repeated so many times they have become part of how people understand who she was. One such story involves a horse. Emperor Taizong had a famously difficult stallion, a powerful, wild animal that no groom could fully control. The horse was magnificent but dangerous. In the presence of the emperor and his attendants, the young Wu reportedly stepped forward and said, "I can manage this horse. Give me 3 things. An iron whip, an iron hammer, and a sharp dagger. I will whip him first. If he doesn't submit, I will hammer his skull. And if he still resists, I will cut his throat." The story is probably apocryphal. Or embellished. Or both. But it has been told and retold for 14 centuries because it captures something about how Wu was later perceived as a person of exceptional will and ruthless clarity, even in youth. Whether or not Taizong found this impressive or alarming, the historical record suggests that Wu did not become a particular favorite of his. She remained at a middling rank throughout his reign. She served him, likely including in the physical intimacy that court life at the inner palace involved, but she did not rise dramatically. She was not, so far as we can tell, the object of imperial obsession or passionate devotion. But she was there. And in being there, she was receiving an education that could not have been obtained anywhere else in the world. The inner palace was the nerve center of the empire. Even in the segregated, hierarchical world of court life, a woman of intelligence and attention could learn an enormous amount about how power actually worked. She could observe which ministers rose and which fell, and begin to understand why. She could listen, in the way that people who are not taken seriously are often permitted to listen, to conversations about policy, military strategy, the management of provinces, the subtleties of factional politics. She could learn how emperors made decisions, how they were influenced by those around them, what they feared, what they valued, what they ignored. Wu learned all of this. She also had access to the Imperial Library, one of the greatest collections of texts in the world at that time, and she read widely. History, poetry, philosophy, law. The texts of the past dynasties. The administrative manuals and strategic treatises that were the working documents of imperial governance. She also, during this period, encountered a young man who would eventually change the entire direction of her life. His name was Li Ji. He was the 9th son of Emperor Taizong, young, gentle, somewhat scholarly in temperament, not initially considered a serious contender for the throne. The relationship between them in these early years is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Later sources suggest a tenderness, an intellectual sympathy, a mutual recognition between two people who might have seemed, from the outside, to be in entirely different categories of existence: the emperor's son, full of uncertain potential, and the low-ranking palace woman, full of suppressed intelligence. We cannot know exactly what passed between them in those years. We can only note that when everything changed, when Taizong died in 649, when Li Ji became Emperor Gaozong, and when Wu's life entered its next phase, Li Ji knew exactly who she was. When an emperor died, the accepted practice was for his consorts and ladies-in-waiting who had not borne him children to be sent to Buddhist convents. They would shave their heads, take religious vows, and live out their days in quiet, pious retirement. This was considered the honorable course. It was also, for most of these women, an effective ending to any prospect of worldly life. Wu was sent to Ganye Convent, near Chang'an. She shaved her head. She put on the gray robes. She presumably went through the appropriate religious observances. And she waited. Again. She was 25 years old. She had spent the first half of her adult life inside an imperial palace, and now she was in a convent, and the life she might have had seemed to have closed quietly behind her, like a gate made of silk. But Li Ji had not forgotten her. Part 3: The Emperor's Favor, Return from the Convent. There are moments in history that seem, in retrospect, like the turning of a very large, very slow wheel. The moment when Li Ji sent for Wu Zetian from the convent at Ganye was one of those moments. It did not look dramatic, from the outside. An emperor summons a woman he remembers. She returns to the palace. She is given a new title. Life continues. And yet within that quiet movement, a carriage traveling the road from the convent to Chang'an, a woman watching the city reappear through the window, the history of China was beginning, very slowly, to bend. The new emperor, Li Ji, had taken the reign title Gaozong, meaning high ancestor. He was a man of genuine intellect and considerable charm, but he was also, at least in the early years of his reign, somewhat overshadowed by the powerful ministers who had served his father. Taizong's court had been full of remarkable men, administrators, generals, philosophers. The transition to Gaozong brought political tension, factional competition, and the constant anxiety of a new ruler trying to establish his authority. It was in this context that Gaozong summoned Wu. The exact timing is a matter of some scholarly debate. Some sources suggest she was summoned as early as 650, just a year after Taizong's death. Others place it slightly later. What is clear is that by 651, Wu was back in the palace, and that Gaozong's attachment to her was immediate and profound. She arrived not as a low-ranking Karanu this time, but as an object of genuine imperial attention. Gaozong elevated her rank rapidly. She was given the title of Zhoui, a second-rank consort, a significant leap from her previous position. She was given her own residence in the inner palace, her own staff, her own resources. And she began, quietly, to build. The inner palace was at this time dominated by the Empress Wang, Gaozong's formal empress, and by another favored consort known as Consort Xiao, called Pure Consort Xiao in court records. These two women had their own political ambitions, their own factions, their own networks of influence. The empress and the consort were, interestingly, rivals with each other, but they would soon find in Wu a common enemy that transcended their competition. For a time, there is a historical suggestion that Empress Wang had even encouraged Gaozong's interest in Wu, hoping that a new favorite would draw the emperor's attention away from consort Xiao. If so, it was a spectacular miscalculation. Wu moved with the patience and thoroughness of someone who had spent a very long time preparing without knowing exactly what she was preparing for. She cultivated relationships with the household eunuchs and female servants who controlled the day-to-day flow of information within the inner palace. She demonstrated to Gaozong an intellectual companionship that went far beyond what court conventions typically expected from a consort, discussing with him matters of state policy, reading to him, engaging him in philosophical conversation, learning the landscape of his anxieties and his ambitions. She bore him children, a son in 652, another son shortly after, and eventually a daughter who would become, in one of the most haunting episodes of her early rise to power, the center of a tragedy that still reverberates across the centuries. The death of this infant daughter is one of the most contested episodes in Wu Zetian's story. The traditional account, heavily shaped by sources hostile to Wu, holds that she herself strangled the newborn, then accused Empress Wang of the murder, using the tragedy to destroy her rival. This version of events has been repeated so many times that it has become almost indelibly associated with Wu's name. The truth, as historians who have examined the sources carefully now acknowledge, is simply unknowable. Infant mortality in Tang China was high. The political circumstances were such that accusation would have come naturally in either direction. What can be said is that in the aftermath of the child's death, Gaozong came to believe, or was persuaded to believe, that Empress Wang was responsible. And this belief, whether founded on truth or on something darker, set in motion a series of events that would end with the Empress stripped of her title and eventually her life. What is striking, when you sit with the evidence at a distance, is how little certainty there is, and how much of Wu's historical reputation has been built on accusations made by the very men and the very faction she was in the process of defeating. The charges against her were written down by her enemies, often decades after the events they described, in a political environment in which blackening her name served clear purposes. This does not make her a saint. It makes her a human being whose life has been filtered through centuries of motivated storytelling. By the year 655, Wu's position had become unassailable. Gaozong, over the fierce objections of his most senior ministers, declared his intention to elevate Wu to the rank of empress. The opposition was immediate and powerful. The great ministers of state, men like Chu Suiliang and Zhangsun Wuji, who had served Taizong and considered themselves the guardians of dynastic tradition, argued strenuously against it. A former consort of a previous emperor could not be elevated to empress. It was contrary to propriety. It was dangerous precedent. It was, they implied, beneath the dignity of the Tang house. Gaozong listened. He hesitated. And then, in the autumn of 655, he proceeded anyway. Wu Zetian, the timber merchant's daughter, the girl who had entered the palace at 14 as a fifth-rank consort, the woman who had spent 2 years in a convent, was now Empress of China. She was 31 years old. And she was just beginning. Part 4: The Making of an Empress, Power Shared and Power Taken. When a new empress was enthroned in Tang China, there were ceremonies. Rituals that had been carried out for centuries, that connected the living woman in her embroidered robes to every empress who had ever stood in that particular configuration of light and incense smoke. Imagine the smell of it. The heavy sweetness of sandalwood. The cool stone floors of the ceremonial hall. The sound of bronze bells, deep and resonant, vibrating in the chest rather than just the ears. The weight of the headdress, its ornaments trembling faintly with each movement. The rows of courtiers in their ranked robes, silk in carefully specified colors, indicating precisely where each person stood in the hierarchy of the empire. Wu moved through these ceremonies with a stillness that those who were present later described as remarkable. Not rigid. Not cold. But contained. As if she were carrying something very large and very fragile, and knew it. The invisible expansion was something else entirely. Gaozong, throughout the 650s and 660s, suffered from increasing illness. The records describe symptoms consistent with what modern physicians might identify as severe hypertension, blinding headaches, dizziness, visual disturbances that at times left him unable to read state documents. These episodes came and went, and during the periods when they were most severe, someone had to manage the business of the empire. Wu managed it. This was unusual but not, in the Tang system, entirely without precedent. Empresses had served as regents before, particularly for young emperors. What was unusual was the degree of Wu's engagement, not ceremonial management or the maintenance of existing policies, but genuine active governance, reading memorials from officials, corresponding with ministers, making decisions about appointments, policy, and in some cases military strategy. She was, in effect, co-ruling the empire. The phrase that Chinese historians later used for this arrangement was the two sages Ershing, the two holy rulers. It referred to Gaozong and Wu ruling together, presented in official language as a harmonious partnership. The reality was more nuanced. Gaozong remained emperor in title and in the periods of his health, but Wu was increasingly indispensable. And as she became indispensable, she became powerful in ways that went beyond the inner palace. She cultivated relationships with officials and scholars who were outside the established aristocratic factions. The old guard, the men who had opposed her elevation to empress, had largely been broken. Zhang Sunwuji, one of the most powerful ministers of the early Tang, had been exiled and eventually forced to his death. Zhu Suiliang had been dismissed and died in obscurity in the south. The men who had stood between Wu and the throne had, one by one, been removed, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient, incremental application of political pressure over years. In their place, Wu promoted men who owed their careers to her patronage rather than to the hereditary aristocracy. This was not simply personal favoritism, it was a structural transformation of how power worked at the Tang court. By elevating men on the basis of ability and loyalty to the crown rather than birth, Wu was continuing and deepening the meritocratic reforms that Taizong had begun, but doing so in a way that also happened to strengthen her own position considerably. She also demonstrated a consistent interest in the welfare of the peasant population, reducing taxes in regions struck by natural disaster, ordering investigations into the conduct of local officials who abused their position, creating mechanisms for ordinary people to submit petitions to the throne. These policies had both a genuine humanitarian dimension and a clear political logic. A population that believed the empress was their advocate was a population less likely to support aristocratic resistance to her rule. The 660s saw the Tang dynasty reach perhaps its greatest territorial extent. Military campaigns, directed in part by Wu's strategic guidance, extended Tang influence deep into Central Asia, maintained control over the Korean peninsula, and pushed back against threats from the north and west. Chang'an received tribute from dozens of states. The Silk Road commerce that made the city cosmopolitan and wealthy continued to flow. Through all of this, Wu was present, not always visible in the formal records, but present in the decisions, in the tone, in the direction. Gaozong died in 683. He was 55 years old, and his health had been failing for years. In his final period of illness, he had reportedly wept, saying that he wished he could govern better. The empire he left behind was vast, its institutions solid, its armies capable. And it was, in many ways, as much Wu's creation as his. She was 58 years old. A widow. The mother of 4 children, 2 of whom were now adults with their own ambitions. And she was about to enter the most complicated and consequential decade of her life. Part 5: The Regent and the Resistance ruling through sons. After Gaozong's death, the formal structure of power shifted. Wu's eldest surviving son, Li Xian, now Emperor Zhongzong, ascended the throne. He was 28 years old. He had grown up watching his mother govern the empire. He had opinions of his own. He had, importantly, a wife, Empress Wei, whose family had ambitions that did not necessarily align with Wu's continued dominance. Zhongzong's reign lasted approximately 55 days. 55 days. In that brief window, the new emperor made moves that Wu found intolerable, most notably, an attempt to elevate his father-in-law to a position of extraordinary power, a move that would have created a rival center of influence capable of bypassing the Empress Dowager entirely. Wu acted swiftly. She convened the senior ministers. She presented the case for Zhongzong's unfitness to rule. And within weeks of his ascension, Zhongzong was demoted, sent away from the capital, reduced in rank, effectively imprisoned in a distant palace. Her second son, Li Dan, was installed on the throne as Emperor Ruizong. He was more pliant, or perhaps more prudent, than his brother. Under Ruizong, Wu's position as Empress Dowager Regent became the de facto governing arrangement of the empire. Ruizong performed the ceremonial functions of the emperor. Wu made the decisions. This arrangement was, officially, temporary. Regent for a young emperor was an accepted role, even if Ruizong was not particularly young. But temporary in the world of Tang politics was a concept with considerable flexibility. The years of the regency, from 684 onward, were turbulent ones. Opposition to Wu's rule was no longer simply a matter of court factionalism. In 684, a rebellion broke out in the provinces, led by a coalition of Tang princes and officials who objected to what they called the usurpation of power by a woman. The rebellion took the name of its manifesto, a remarkable document written by a scholar named Luo Binwan, which denounced Wu in terms that were simultaneously political and deeply personal. Luo described her as an adulteress, a murderer, a destroyer of the imperial house. The manifesto was eloquent, passionate, and widely circulated. Wu reportedly read it herself and, rather than being angered, expressed admiration for its literary quality while noting that the fault lay with her own advisors, who had allowed such a talented writer to languish in obscurity. The rebellion itself was crushed within months. The Tang armies remained loyal to the central government, which meant, in practice, loyal to Wu. The princes who had led the uprising were captured or fled. Luo Binwan disappeared into history, his fate unknown. But the rebellion had demonstrated something important. The opposition to Wu was real, widespread in certain circles, and willing to resort to armed force. The question of how she would manage this opposition, how she would maintain control over an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast to the deserts of Central Asia, was going to require solutions that went beyond conventional statecraft. What followed is one of the most contested periods of Wu's rule. She created a system of secret informers, people who could report on suspicious activities throughout the court and the provinces. She established a special investigative body, sometimes called the Bureau of Prosecution, staffed by officials loyal to her, which operated with considerable independence and broad powers of arrest and interrogation. The effect of this system on political life at the Tang court was chilling. Officials who had contemplated resistance found themselves unable to trust even their closest colleagues. Accusations, some real, some fabricated by opportunists using the new system for personal vengeance, led to arrests, trials, and in a number of cases executions. Wu's apologists have argued that this was the behavior of a ruler facing genuine sedition, using the tools available to maintain control over a vast and contested empire. Her critics have argued that it was the behavior of a tyrant who used fear as a governing instrument. The truth, as is so often the case, contains elements of both. What is certain is that through this period, Wu's grip on power tightened even as the formal situation ruling as regent through a nominally independent emperor became increasingly difficult to maintain. Ruizong was an intelligent man. He could see what the arrangement was. He navigated it with considerable skill, managing to survive the period without direct confrontation with his mother while also, quietly and persistently, declining to be fully dominated by her. The situation was becoming unstable. Something had to change. And Wu, who had spent a lifetime navigating the unstable situations of others, was already thinking about what to do next. Part 6: The Zhou Dynasty, the woman who became emperor. There is a moment in the later records of the Tang dynasty that seems almost unimaginable in the context of everything that came before it. In the year 690, the Empress Dowager Wu received petitions from ministers, from scholars, from Buddhist monks, from ordinary citizens organized into delegations requesting that she take the throne herself. That she become not regent, not Empress Dowager, not the power behind the throne, but emperor. Not empress. Emperor. The character used was Huangdi, the same title that had been used by every Chinese ruler since the first emperor in 221 BCE. The title that had always, in 1400 years, been held by a man. She declined the petitions. Twice, she declined them. This was conventional ritual a ruler was expected to decline, to express humility, to acknowledge the weight of the honor being offered. The petition had to be made 3 times before acceptance was appropriate. The third petition arrived. Wu accepted. On the 9th day of the 9th month of 690, Wu Zetian declared the foundation of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, named after the ancient Zhou kingdom that Chinese political philosophy held as the model of good governance. She did not claim to continue the Tang dynasty but to replace it, to create something new that was legitimated by her own authority rather than by the Li family bloodline. She was 65 years old. She had been managing the power of the empire, in one form or another, for more than 30 years. And now, finally, the title matched the reality. The investiture ceremony was held in Luoyang, the eastern capital, which Wu had made her primary residence and which she had renamed the divine capital, Shindo, with considerable architectural investment in its temples, markets, and administrative buildings. Luoyang was, in some ways, a more central location than Chang'an for governing the vast empire, sitting at the convergence of major road and river systems that connected the north with the south and the east with the west. Wu stood at the center of ceremonies that had been carefully redesigned to legitimize her unprecedented claim. She wore the imperial robes. She received the obeisances of her ministers. She performed the great ritual sacrifices that confirmed the emperor's mandate from heaven. And in Chinese history, there was no word for what she had become. Or rather, there was only one word, emperor, and it had never before needed to apply to a woman. She addressed this directly, in the way that she addressed most things, practically, and with reference to the ancient texts. She cited precedent where it could be found. There were female rulers in the historical record, women who had served as regents or advisors of immense power. She commissioned scholars to write histories and philosophical arguments that supported the legitimacy of her rule. She promoted the Empress Wu cult of personality with considerable sophistication, using art, architecture, and religious symbolism to communicate her authority. Most significantly, she deepened her patronage of Buddhism in ways that had direct political implications. The Tang dynasty had officially favored Taoism, partly because the Li family claimed descent from Laozi, the legendary founder of Taoist philosophy. Confucianism remained the bedrock of administrative philosophy. Buddhism, while enormously popular throughout Chinese society, had always been somewhat at a distance from the formal ideology of the state. Wu changed this. She promoted Buddhism aggressively, sponsoring the construction of temples and monasteries, patronizing the translation of Buddhist texts, supporting the great cave sculpture projects at Longmen near Luoyang, where enormous figures of the Buddha were carved from living rock in projects that employed thousands of craftsmen over decades. One of the most striking of these projects was the Great Vairocana Buddha at Longmen's Fengxian Temple, a colossal stone figure, seated, serene, with a face that tradition has long held was modeled on Wu herself. Whether this is true in a literal sculptural sense or whether it is a later legend reflecting how people understood the relationship between ruler and divine, it captures something real. Wu understood that religion and political authority were deeply intertwined, and she used Buddhist imagery and language to legitimate her rule in ways that bypassed the Confucian traditions that had always defined leadership as inherently male. There was a Buddhist text called the Great Cloud Sutra, a text that contained a passage prophesying that a female bodhisattva would one day be reincarnated as a queen who would rule the world. Wu's scholars discovered this passage. They wrote lengthy commentaries on it. They had it distributed throughout the empire. It was, by any standard, a remarkable piece of political theology. And it worked, not perfectly, not universally, but sufficiently. The population of the empire, by and large, continued to be governed, to pay taxes, to be protected by Tang armies, to use the Tang legal and administrative system. Wu's rule looked, from the village level, much like Tang rule. The officials who carried out the day-to-day work of governance were largely the same officials who had carried it out before. What had changed was the woman at the top. Part 7, The Court of the Divine Capital: Governance, Culture, and the Examination System. To rule an empire the size of Tang China at the end of the 7th century was to manage a system of almost incomprehensible complexity. Consider what it meant in practical terms. The empire stretched roughly 2,000 miles from east to west and close to 1,500 miles from north to south. It contained somewhere between 50 and 80 million people, the estimates vary, but no one disputes that it was one of the most populous political entities on Earth. It encompassed dozens of distinct ethnic groups, speakers of hundreds of languages and dialects, practitioners of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam, and various local religious traditions. Governing this empire meant managing roads and canals, maintaining granary systems capable of preventing famine in provinces where the harvest had failed, running the postal relay system that carried official correspondence across thousands of miles, administering a legal code that attempted to standardize justice in communities whose local customs varied enormously, maintaining an army capable of defending thousands of miles of frontier, and collecting the taxes and labor service that kept all of this functioning. Wu Zetian, during her years of active rule, engaged with all of this not as a ceremonial figure, but as a working executive. She held morning court, the daily meeting at which senior officials presented reports, requested decisions, and received imperial directives. She read the memorials, the formal written reports and recommendations that flowed continuously from the provinces to the capital, and responded to them. She presided over the ritual ceremonies that were an essential component of imperial legitimacy, performing the great sacrifices to heaven and earth that confirmed the ruler's relationship with the cosmic order. And she reformed the civil examination system in ways that would have permanent consequences for Chinese history. The imperial examination system, the mechanism by which officials were recruited and promoted through written tests rather than purely through hereditary privilege, had existed in some form since the Sui dynasty, and had been developed further under Taizong. But under Wu, it was significantly expanded and deepened. Wu added a new category of examination, the palace examination, in which candidates who had passed the regular examinations were brought to the capital to be examined personally, ultimately, in some cases, by the ruler herself. This innovation had several effects. It gave the central government greater control over the selection of the highest officials. It created a direct symbolic link between officials and the ruler, since those who passed the palace examination were in some sense personally chosen by the throne. And it opened the system to a wider range of candidates by reducing the ability of local powerful families to control who could take the examinations. Wu also created new categories of examination that tested different kinds of ability, not just the classical textual knowledge that had always been the core of the exam system, but practical administrative skills, military strategy, and other competencies that a functioning government actually needed. The long-term effect of these reforms was to accelerate a fundamental transformation of the Chinese ruling class, the gradual displacement of the old hereditary aristocracy by a new class of scholar officials who owed their position to education and examination performance rather than birth. This was a process that would take centuries to complete, but Wu's expansions of the examination system pushed it meaningfully forward. She also maintained her practice of seeking talent from unexpected sources. The most famous example of this is probably the poets and scholars she brought to court, not just as ornaments, but as working officials. The Tang dynasty is remembered as one of the great periods of Chinese poetry, and many of the finest poets of the era had connections to Wu's court, either as direct protégés or as members of the broader cultural environment she helped create. Song Jiwen, Xin Xuanqi, two of the poets whose work helped establish the formal conventions of Tang verse, were members of her administration. The great encyclopedist and administrator Zhang Yu was another. These were not men who simply decorated the court. They were officials who worked alongside scholars, military men, and administrators in the complex machinery of imperial governance. Wu's court at Luoyang became one of the great centers of learning and culture in the world at that time, a place where ideas from across the empire and from beyond its borders circulated, were debated, were written down, and were put to work. At the same time, the court had its darker currents. The system of informers that Wu had established in the 680s continued to cast its shadow over political life. Officials moved carefully, knowing that the wrong word in the wrong company could end a career or worse. The judicial violence of the early years of the regency had moderated somewhat as Wu's position became more secure, but the memory of it shaped behavior in ways that were palpable. And there was another source of controversy, one that her critics at the time and throughout history have seized upon with particular energy. Wu, in her later years of rule, kept male favorites. This was, by the norms of the Tang court, extraordinary. Emperors were expected to maintain harems of consorts, that was simply part of the structure of imperial life. But an empress or empress dowager taking male lovers was unprecedented, and the people she chose made the situation even more charged. The most famous of these favorites were the Zhang brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, charming, handsome, somewhat frivolous young men who rose to positions of considerable influence at court in the final decades of Wu's rule. They were given official titles, they attended court functions, they had access to the empress that senior ministers struggled to obtain. Officials and scholars who wanted imperial attention sometimes had to approach it through the Zhang brothers, which was not calculated to endear those young men to the serious, Confucian-trained administrators of the empire. Were they simply companions? Were they politically significant? Were they, as later sources suggest, corrupt and self-serving, using their position to advance their own interests and the interests of their family at the expense of good governance? The honest answer is, probably some combination of all of these things. The picture is blurred by the hostility of the sources. What is clear is that by the early 700s, the presence of the Zhang brothers had become a genuine political irritant, a symbol, to many officials, of what they saw as a court that had drifted from the stern meritocratic principles that Wu had once championed. But that was still in the future. For most of the 690s, the court of the divine capital was a functioning, sophisticated, and in many ways remarkable center of imperial power. Wu was making it work. Part 8: The Frontiers of Empire, War, Diplomacy, and the Edges of the Known World. There is a quality to great empires that is easy to forget when you are thinking about their courts and their politics and their cultural achievements. They have edges. Physical edges, where the settled world ends and something less legible begins. Mountains, deserts, steppes. Peoples who do not speak the emperor's language and do not recognize the emperor's authority. The constant, grinding, expensive work of maintaining those edges. Wu Zetian's empire had many edges, and they were all active at once. To the north and northwest, the great steppe grasslands stretched toward Siberia and Central Asia, inhabited by Turkic nomadic confederacies whose relationship with the Tang had alternated, over the decades, between alliance, tributary submission, and open warfare. The Eastern Turks had been defeated by Taizong in the 630s and brought into a subordinate relationship with the Tang. But nomadic politics was fluid, confederacies rose and fell, leaders were replaced, alliances shifted. The threat was never permanently resolved, only managed. During Wu's period of active rule, the Turkic Confederacy reconstituted itself under a series of capable khagans and began pressing against the empire's northern frontier with renewed intensity. Wu's response was partly military, expensive, difficult campaigns in the steppe that achieved mixed results, and partly diplomatic, using the sophisticated Tang system of marriage alliances, tributary relationships, and managed trade to maintain a workable if imperfect relationship with the steppe peoples. The Great Wall systems in the north were maintained and in some sections extended. Garrison forces in the northern frontier zones were kept supplied through the government grain distribution system. Military governors, jadushi, were given broad authority to respond to threats in their regions, a delegation of power that would have important long-term consequences that Wu could not have fully anticipated. To the west, the Tang Empire had extended its influence deep into Central Asia, establishing protectorates over the small oasis states along the Silk Road, Turfan, Kutcha, Samarkand, and others that were essential to the overland trade connecting China with Persia, India, and the Mediterranean world. This sphere of influence was constantly contested by the newly powerful Tibetan Empire, the Tubo, which had emerged in the 7th century as a major regional power with its own ambitions in Central Asia. The Tibetan-Tang conflict was one of the defining strategic relationships of the era. The Tibetans had briefly controlled significant Tang territory in the 670s during a period of Tang weakness, and the struggle to restore Tang influence in Central Asia was a major military and diplomatic preoccupation of Wu's government throughout her years of rule. There were spectacular successes: the recapture of the 4 garrisons of Anxi in 692, which restored Tang control over a key stretch of the Silk Road, was celebrated as a major military achievement. But there were also defeats, and the Tibetan Empire remained a formidable adversary throughout the period. To the northeast, the Korean peninsula remained a complex zone. The Tang had helped the Silla kingdom defeat the rival Baekje and Goguryeo kingdoms in the 660s, but the subsequent attempt to establish direct Tang control over the peninsula had failed when Silla successfully resisted Tang domination and maintained its independence. By Wu's period of active rule, a settled relationship with Silla, tributary but genuinely autonomous, had emerged. To the south, the empire extended into what is now Vietnam, and the governance of these southern territories, ecologically and culturally very different from the heartland, presented its own challenges. Local resistance to Tang administrative control surfaced periodically and was managed with varying degrees of success. What is remarkable, looking at this strategic panorama, is the degree to which Wu managed to maintain the empire's overall integrity through it all. The Tang state did not significantly shrink during her rule. The core institutions, the examination system, the legal code, the granary system, the road and postal network, continued to function. The extraordinary cultural and economic vitality of Chang'an and Luoyang was maintained. This was not, by any measure, the reign of a ruler who was simply resting on the achievements of her predecessors or presiding over decline. It was active, engaged governance of extraordinary complexity, sustained over decades by a woman who had prepared for it, in one way or another, over the course of her entire life. The costs were real in taxation, in labor service, in the lives of soldiers sent to distant frontiers. The compromises were real, the sometimes ugly internal security apparatus, the political violence of the early Regency years. No portrait of Wu is complete that omits these things. But neither is any portrait complete that reduces her to the caricature her enemies drew: the scheming witch, the unnatural woman, the destroyer of dynastic order. The empire she managed was, for most of the people living in it, reasonably well governed by the standards of the age. She was a ruler. A real one. With all the complexity, the moral weight, and the historical significance that implies. Part 9: The World She Made, Women, Society, and the Tang Cultural Moment. It is tempting to imagine that Wu Zetian's rise to supreme power had sweeping and immediate consequences for the lives of other women in Tang China. The temptation should be resisted, or at least complicated. The world she governed was not, in any fundamental structural sense, a world that treated women as equals. The Confucian framework that governed social organization remained in place. Women were still expected, by law and by custom, to subordinate themselves to their fathers, their husbands, their sons. Inheritance law favored male heirs. Women could not sit the civil service examinations. The pathways to public life and public authority that Wu had navigated with such extraordinary skill were not, for the most part, opened wider by her success. And yet, the Tang dynasty is remembered, and fairly remembered, as an unusually open period in Chinese women's history. Tang women of the upper classes had considerable freedom by the standards of most other periods in Chinese history. They rode horses. They played polo. There are famous Tang paintings showing women playing polo, and the evidence that this was common among elite women is substantial. They appeared in public relatively freely, without the constraints that would become much more severe in later periods. Divorce, while not easy, was possible. Women could own property under certain circumstances. Widows were not uniformly expected to remain unmarried. How much of this was specifically Wu's influence, and how much was simply the particular character of Tang culture at its peak, is impossible to disentangle fully. What can be said is that Wu's visibility, the sheer unavoidable fact of her presence at the pinnacle of the political world, created a cultural environment in which the question of what women could do and be was live in a way it had never been before. Her patronage of scholarship and literature extended to women. She encouraged female literacy. She brought educated women into positions of influence within the court. The records mention female officials, female scholars, women who served in administrative capacities in the inner palace bureaucracy with genuine responsibilities. The poets of the Tang and the Tang-produced extraordinary poets wrote about women with a complexity and a humanity that is sometimes startling. Women are subjects of Tang poetry not just as objects of beauty or vehicles for male longing, but as people with inner lives, ambitions, sorrows, and pleasures of their own. This is not entirely Wu's doing, but it is difficult to imagine it existing in quite the same way without the cultural signal her reign sent. There is also the art. The Tang dynasty produced some of the most beautiful objects in the history of Chinese civilization, and many of those objects, the famous Tang Sankai pottery figures, the silk textiles, the gold and silver metalwork, the cave sculptures, were made during Wu's period of active rule or in the immediately surrounding decades that her patronage helped shape. The Longmen grottos, which Wu sponsored so lavishly, are still standing today, immense carved faces emerging from the limestone cliffs above the Yi River near Luoyang, their expression serene and slightly mysterious in the way that all great art is slightly mysterious. To stand in front of them is to feel the weight of time, and to understand something about the ambition of the civilization that made them. Wu also sponsored the compilation of several important scholarly works, encyclopedias, histories, collections of administrative law that preserve knowledge and set standards for intellectual work that influenced Chinese scholarship for generations. She was, in other words, not just a political ruler but a cultural patron of the first order. The world she made was not just a political arrangement but an aesthetic and intellectual environment that shaped how people thought, wrote, and imagined the possible. And at its center, always, was this woman aging now, but still present, still watching, still making decisions, whose life had been a continuous act of making possible what had never been possible before. Part 10, The End of an Empire, the Xinlong Coup and the Return of Tang. By the year 700, Wu was in her mid-70s. She had been governing, in one form or another, for more than 50 years. She had outlived 3 emperors, survived multiple rebellions, managed the most complex administrative system in the world, and held the title of emperor for a full decade. She was, by any measure, extraordinary. But the human body, no matter how remarkable the mind inside it, has its limits. Wu's health had been declining slowly through the early 700s. She had moved largely from the public ceremonial life of the court to a more private existence in her palace at Luoyang. The Zhang brothers were ever-present companions. The daily business of government was increasingly managed by senior officials who had her trust and her delegation of authority, but who also had their own views about the future. And the future, increasingly, looked like a question. Wu had no clear or widely accepted plan for succession. The Zhou dynasty she had created was, theoretically, a new dynastic house, but it had no natural heir except through her own children, who were Li family members, Tang princes. To pass the throne to one of them was, in a sense, to end the Zhou dynasty before it had fairly begun and to restore the Tang. To pass it to someone from the Wu family, her nephews, for instance, had at times seemed like candidates, was to create a succession that had its own problems, since those men were not the children of an emperor and had no personal claim on the loyalty of the armies and the officials. This ambiguity was politically dangerous. And around it gathered the faction of officials, men who had served loyally through Wu's reign but who were, at heart, Tang loyalists, believers in the legitimacy of the Li family and the Tang dynastic tradition. In the first month of 705, Wu was gravely ill, confined to her palace. The Zhang brothers were her constant attendants, and this gave her critics a way to frame what happened next. A group of senior officials, led by the Chancellor Zhang Jianji, along with several other high-ranking men, moved against the Zhang brothers in what became known as the Shenlong coup. They assembled a force of imperial guards, entered the palace precincts, and killed the two Zhang brothers. They then went to Wu's bedchamber. What happened in that room between the old woman in her bed and the officials who had come, ostensibly to deal with corrupt favorites but really to restore the Tang dynasty, we cannot know exactly. The sources are carefully shaped. They describe an exchange in which Wu asked who had come, was told the names of the officials, and apparently accepted the situation. She was 80 years old. She had been emperor for 15 years. She had governed China, in one form or another, for half a century. And now the men with the swords in the corridor were asking her to give it up. She abdicated. On the fourth day of the second month of 705, she formally surrendered the imperial title and position to her son Li Xian, the former Zhangzong, who was restored to the throne as Tang emperor. The Zhou dynasty ended. The Tang dynasty was restored. It had taken, from first to last, exactly 15 years and a few months. Wu was moved to a smaller palace, the Shangyang Palace near Luoyang, still comfortable, still served, but removed from the center of power. She spent her final months there. The sources describe her as having accepted the situation with composure, perhaps with relief, after the exhaustion of so many decades of governance. She died on the 11th day of the 11th month of 705. She was somewhere between 80 and 82 years old. The exact year of her birth remains uncertain. She had been born into the early Tang, when the dynasty was barely a decade old. She had lived through its expansion, its cultural flowering, and its greatest crisis. She had been, for more than half a century, one of the central figures in Chinese civilization. Before she died, she did something that seems, when you think about it, almost impossibly poignant. She issued an edict asking that her posthumous name be reduced in scope, that rather than the elaborate string of honorifics that emperors typically accumulated, she be known simply as Zetian, meaning, roughly, in accord with heaven. And she asked that the tall stone monument to be erected at her tomb, the standard Tang memorial stele, the kind on which an emperor's great deeds were inscribed, be left blank. No inscription. No official account of her reign. Just stone. Smooth and blank and enduring. What did she mean by it? The question has occupied scholars for 1400 years. Was it humility? Was it defiance, a refusal to let her enemies define her? Was it a kind of challenge, an invitation for history to write on that surface whatever it wished? The blank stele still stands, at the Qianling Mausoleum in Shanxi Province, near the tomb she shares with Emperor Gaozong. It is one of the most visited historical monuments in China. People still go there and look at the smooth, weathered surface and think about what it means. No words. And all of history, all the same. Part 11, The Judgment of History, How Wu Zetian Has Been Remembered. There is a particular way that history treats women who hold power. It tends to judge them differently than it judges men who hold the same power and do the same things. The political violence that is described as decisive leadership in a male emperor becomes ruthlessness or cruelty in a female one. The strategic maneuvering that is called political genius in a king becomes scheming or manipulation in a queen. The keeping of intimate companions, which is simply taken for granted in male rulers, becomes a source of moral condemnation when the ruler is a woman. Wu Zetian's historical reputation has been shaped, over 14 centuries, by exactly this kind of double standard applied with great consistency by a tradition of male historians writing within a Confucian framework that treated female rulership as inherently abnormal, even monstrous. The canonical negative portrait of Wu was largely established by the Song dynasty historian Ouyang Xiu, writing in the 11th century, 400 years after her death. Ouyang Xiu called her a disaster, a destroyer of the Tang house, a woman of insatiable ambition who corrupted everything she touched. His account emphasized the political killings, the sexual scandals, the usurpation. It became, for centuries, the standard view. Within that standard view, certain stories took on a life of their own. The strangled daughter. The handless and eyeless empress and consort. The Zhang brothers and their debaucheries. The networks of terror that made the court a place of fear. Whether any of these stories are accurate in their details, whether they are exaggerated, whether some are simply invented, the standard view did not require that question to be asked. She was the woman who had done the impossible and the impermissible thing, and so she must have been a monster. The logic was circular, but it was powerful. The feminist reappraisal of Wu began in the 20th century and gathered considerable force in the later decades of that century and into the present one. Chinese scholars and Western ones began reading the sources more carefully, asking who had written them, when, and with what motivation. The hostile portraits began to look less like objective history and more like political documents, written to delegitimize what could not be undone. What emerged from this re-examination was a more complicated figure. Not a saint, Wu was capable of ruthlessness, and the political violence of her regency years cannot be wished away. But not a monster either. A highly capable ruler who governed during one of the greatest periods of Chinese civilization, who expanded the examination system in ways that shaped Chinese society for centuries, who patronized art and scholarship, who maintained the empire's territory and internal stability through decades of complex challenges. The question of whether she was good or bad, the question that tends to dominate popular discussion of historical rulers, is perhaps less interesting than the question of what her life reveals about the structures of power, gender, and legitimacy in Tang China and in Chinese civilization more broadly. She revealed, simply by existing and doing what she did, that the exclusion of women from political power was not a natural fact but a constructed arrangement, an arrangement that could be undone, had been undone, and that rested on nothing more solid than convention and the willingness of enough people to enforce it. That revelation was deeply threatening to the men who controlled the official record of Chinese history. And so they worked, very hard, for many centuries, to make sure that her example would not be repeated, that her life would be remembered as a cautionary tale rather than a precedent. They mostly succeeded, in the sense that no woman again held the title of emperor in China. But they did not entirely succeed, in the sense that Wu Zetian's name survived, her story survived, and every generation that has encountered that story has had to reckon with what it means. In China today, she is a figure of considerable cultural fascination. She appears in films, novels, television dramas. She is the subject of academic conferences and popular biographies. The Qianling Mausoleum draws thousands of visitors a year. The blank stele is photographed millions of times. History, it turns out, has written on that stone after all, not in carved characters, but in the sheer weight of attention, the accumulated significance of so many people across so many centuries coming to look, and to think, and to wonder. Part 12, The Blank Stele, Legacies, Lessons, and the Long Echo. Let us, in this last part of our journey, slow down even further. Let us allow the history to settle, the way the dust settles after a long journey, which is where we began, if you remember. That image of dust and stillness. Of a young girl reading by candlelight in a world that no longer exists. Wu Zetian lived in a world of extraordinary richness and extraordinary constraint. The Tang dynasty was, in many ways, a civilization at the height of its powers, intellectually sophisticated, aesthetically refined, militarily formidable, economically complex. It produced great poetry, great sculpture, great philosophy. It welcomed foreigners and foreign ideas with a confidence that came from knowing itself to be, at that moment, the most powerful and most sophisticated state in the world. And within that world, a woman navigated a path that no one had navigated before, that no one has navigated since. The path was not straightforward. It was not clean. It involved compromises and cruelties that we cannot honestly set aside. It involved a degree of political violence that is genuinely troubling. It involved the use of fear as a governing instrument in ways that cast shadows over even the genuine achievements of her reign. But it also involved something that deserves recognition and admiration, an extraordinary sustained exercise of intelligence, will, patience, and adaptability over 8 decades of human life, in conditions that were almost entirely stacked against the outcome she achieved. She was not supposed to exist. Not as emperor, not as the dominant political force of her time, not as the figure whose decisions shaped the history of the largest empire in the world. Every structure of her society, legal, social, religious, philosophical, said that what she did was not possible. She did it anyway. What does that tell us? Perhaps it tells us, quietly, that the structures that say something is not possible are always, at some level, provisional. That they rest on the willingness of people to believe in them and enforce them. That when someone with sufficient intelligence, preparation, and will decides to treat them as the conventions they actually are rather than the natural laws they claim to be, things change. This is not a simple or straightforwardly happy lesson. Wu's path involved the dismantling of others, the political careers, the freedom, in some cases the lives, of the people who stood in her way. Power, in any age, has costs. The pursuit of it, and the exercise of it, involves moral weight that cannot be distributed evenly or absorbed cleanly. But the existence of those costs does not cancel the achievement. And the achievement was real. Think about the examination system as she left it more open, more meritocratic, a more genuine mechanism for recruiting talent from the full range of Chinese society rather than only from the hereditary aristocracy. This reform, which Wu deepened and extended, contributed to a gradual transformation of Chinese governance that continued to develop over the following centuries and that shaped, in important ways, the character of Chinese civilization. Think about the cultural patronage, the poetry, the sculpture, the scholarship, the Buddhist art that still endures in the Longmen grottos. The Tang cultural achievement, which later generations would look back on as a golden age, was shaped in significant part by the court that Wu presided over at its peak. Think about the diplomatic and administrative work that maintained the empire's territorial integrity and institutional functioning through decades of challenges that, without competent management, could easily have resulted in the kind of fragmentation and civil war that plagued China in other periods. And think about the symbol. The woman whose very existence as ruler says, "The categories you have been given are not the only ones. The world you have inherited is not the only possible world." The blank steel at Shenling is perhaps the most perfect emblem of her life. She had spent 80 years having other people's words applied to her: praise, accusation, condemnation, celebration, all of it shaped by agendas she had to navigate without being fully able to control. And at the end, she chose blankness. She chose to let the stone be what it was, and to let whatever came after fill it or leave it empty as it chose. History has not left it empty. But history has not agreed either. The stone remains open. The question of what to make of her remains open. And that openness, that refusal to resolve, to simplify, to reduce her to a single legible verdict, is perhaps the most honest tribute that 14 centuries could have offered to someone whose life was, from beginning to end, a demonstration that the world is more complicated than the rules say it is. But the memory remains. The extraordinary, inconvenient, undeniable fact of her remains. In the carved stone faces at Longmen. In the examination halls that her reforms helped shape. In the blank steel at Shenling where the winter wind moves quietly across surfaces that have been touched, across all the centuries, by so many wondering hands. She was here. She ruled. She left her mark in the most enduring way possible, not in words, but in the shape of the world she left behind. Closing meditation. The night is very quiet now. Somewhere in Shanxi province, the stars are out above the Wei River Valley. The same stars that were out 14 centuries ago, when a girl in a candlelit room was just beginning to understand the world and her place in it. The mountains are the same mountains. The lush hills are the same hills. The wind moves through the same grasses. Let your breathing slow now. Let your body be heavy and warm. You have traveled a very long way tonight, across 14 centuries, across the breadth of an empire, through the innermost rooms of power and the quietest hours of a very long human life. You can set it all down now. The silk and the ceremony. The candlelight. The blank stone. The sound of bells. Let them settle, gently, into the part of you that keeps the things it encounters on long, slow journeys. Not in the front of the mind, where thoughts are noisy and urgent. But deeper. In the quiet place where history becomes something you've felt rather than something you've been told. Wu Zetian was born. She read. She watched. She waited. She acted. She ruled. She left. And the world she moved through remembered her, imperfectly and persistently, for a very long time. As all the remarkable ones are remembered. Your breath is slowing. The room around you is still. The night is holding you gently, the way the past holds all of us, not tightly, not intrusively, but with a kind of deep and patient presence. Like stone that has been warmed by the sun and retains that warmth. Expanded Part 1, A World of Silk and Ceremony, the Tang Dynasty and its Age, continued. There is something worth dwelling on a little longer about the world into which Wu Zetian was born, because the specific texture of Tang civilization helps explain, in ways that dates and names alone cannot, how a story like hers was even possible. The Tang dynasty inherited its geography from the Sui, which had briefly unified China after nearly 4 centuries of division. Those centuries of division, the period Chinese historians sometimes call the Age of Disunity, had done something unexpected to Chinese culture. They had opened it. Foreign ideas, foreign religions, foreign peoples had flowed into the fragmented kingdoms of northern and southern China in ways that the tightly controlled unified empires of earlier centuries had kept out. Buddhism had become not just an imported religion but a genuinely Chinese one, embedded in the lives of ordinary people and the intellectual frameworks of scholars and monks. Central Asian music, dance, and visual arts had been absorbed into the Chinese cultural vocabulary. Foods, textiles, and technologies from across the Silk Road had changed what people ate, wore, and made. The Tang inherited all of this openness and added to it the confidence of a newly reunified, expansionist empire. The result was a civilization that was, in the 7th and early 8th centuries, arguably the most cosmopolitan in the world. Chang'an had neighborhoods where Persian Zoroastrian fire temples stood within walking distance of Buddhist monasteries and Taoist sanctuaries. Merchants from Sogdia, the great trading civilization of Central Asia centered on Samarkand, ran bazaars in the Western market. Korean students came to study at the Imperial Academy. Japanese missions arrived regularly, carrying artists and scholars who wanted to learn everything the Tang had to offer and bring it back to their islands. The musicians in the Tang court played instruments from across Asia: the pipa, a lute with Central Asian origins, the kongho, a harp with roots in Persia, drums from India, flutes from the Korean peninsula. The dancers who performed at imperial banquets included Central Asian performers famous for a spinning style of dance that was considered dizzyingly exotic and attractive. The painters of the Tang depicted not just Chinese subjects but the horses of the steppe, the camels of the Silk Road, the faces of foreigners with deep-set eyes and prominent noses who had made their way to the capital and become, in some sense, part of what Chang'an was. Into this world, Wu was born and raised. Her father's position as a successful merchant-turned-official meant that she was not sheltered from the cosmopolitan energy of Tang life. She would have encountered, growing up, the diversity that was simply part of daily experience in the larger cities of the early Tang. She would have heard music from 3 continents. She would have tasted foods that had traveled the Silk Road. She would have encountered, in the households of her father's official associates, men and women of backgrounds and educations that the old aristocratic families of pure Chinese lineage might have looked down upon but that the new Tang meritocracy was learning to value. This early exposure to the wide world, to the idea that categories could be crossed, that origins did not determine destiny, that talent and intelligence could be found in unexpected places, seems, in retrospect, like a kind of preparation. Not deliberate. Not anyone's plan. But a preparation nonetheless, for a life that would require exactly the ability to see past the categories that everyone else accepted as natural and permanent. Her mother, from the Yang family, was also an important influence. The Yang family had produced the last empress of the Sui dynasty, the Empress Xiao, wife of the disastrous last Sui emperor Yang Wang. Wu's mother had seen, from close enough to feel its heat, the destruction of a dynasty. She had grown up in a family that had experienced the catastrophic end of absolute power, the collapse of everything that had seemed permanent and unshakable. This was not an abstract lesson. It was embodied knowledge, passed down through family memory, about the fragility of political arrangements and the importance of adaptability. It seems more than coincidental that the woman who would navigate the most precarious path in Chinese political history had a mother who came from a family that had already learned, at tremendous cost, that nothing in political life is as stable as it looks. Wu's childhood and early adolescence, the years before she entered the palace, were spent in a household that was prosperous, educated, and in many ways unusual. Her father's willingness to include her in adult conversations, to educate her beyond the conventional female curriculum, to treat her intelligence as something to be developed rather than suppressed, gave her tools that the palace would later sharpen to an almost unimaginable edge. She learned calligraphy, which in Tang China was not merely a practical skill but an art form of enormous cultural prestige and a direct expression of the writer's character and cultivation. She learned music, probably the qin, the seven-stringed zither that was the instrument of scholars and gentlemen, and possibly other instruments as well. She learned the 5 classics of Confucian learning, the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the Book of Rites, the Book of Changes, and the Spring and Autumn Annals, the foundational texts of Chinese intellectual and political culture. She learned history. She developed the wide reading and retentive memory that would later allow her to engage with any subject that came before her as emperor. And she learned, perhaps most importantly, how to read people. The small signals in posture and tone and choice of words that tell you what a person actually thinks and wants and fears, as opposed to what they are saying. This kind of reading, the patient, attentive interpretation of the human beings around you, is a skill that can be taught, but it also requires a particular kind of mind. A mind that is genuinely curious about other people. That finds them interesting rather than merely instrumental. Wu had that kind of mind. It shows in every account of her, even the hostile ones. She remembered people. She paid attention to them. She understood that every person she encountered was a complete world of motivations and histories and fears, and that navigating those worlds was the real substance of political life, far more than any formal rule or legal provision. This was the young woman who arrived at the Tang imperial court at the age of 13 or 14, curious, prepared, and entirely unaware of what her life would become. Expanded Part 2, Inside the Forbidden Palace, The Years of Waiting, continued. The inner palace of Tang Chang'an was governed by rules so elaborate and so thoroughly internalized that they had become, for the women who lived within them, something like a second nature. The rules governed when you rose, what you wore, how you moved through corridors, how you addressed those above you in rank, how you managed those below. They governed the preparation and consumption of food, the performance of seasonal ceremonies, the appropriate responses to births and deaths and illnesses within the imperial family. For a young woman arriving from outside, these rules were a kind of language that had to be learned from scratch. The older women of the palace, the senior consorts, the female officials who managed the inner administration, the experienced servants, watched the new arrivals with a combination of practiced indifference and sharp assessment. The newcomers who adapted quickly, who learned the language, who navigated the social hierarchies without making enemies unnecessarily, tended to survive and even prosper. The ones who were too rigid, too naive, too obvious in their ambitions, or too careless in their loyalties tended not to. Wu adapted quickly. She had the advantage of a good education, which meant that the Confucian textual basis of court ceremony was already familiar to her. She had the advantage of a naturally observant temperament, which meant that the social dynamics of the inner palace, who had influence, who was rising, who was falling, which alliances were real and which were merely performed, became legible to her relatively quickly. But she also had the disadvantage of her low rank. As a Karanu fifth-tier consort, she was not in a position to build the kind of influence that came with regular imperial attention. She was one of many women in a vast institution designed to manage many women, and the emperor's time and attention were finite. Emperor Taizong, in these years, was a man at the height of his powers and his confidence. He had consolidated the dynasty, expanded the empire, and survived the violent internal politics that had brought him to the throne, a story that involves the killing of his own brothers, a fact that Taizong carried with visible moral weight for the rest of his life. He was an impressive man by any measure, but also a complicated one. A conqueror who read poetry. A ruler who invited criticism from his ministers and genuinely seemed to take it seriously. A man who understood that the dynasty he had built rested, in the end, on the loyalty of the people who served it, and that loyalty was earned rather than simply commanded. Wu, watching him from her relatively distant position in the inner palace hierarchy, was observing one of the most skilled rulers of the age. Whatever she thought of him personally, and we have no direct record of her feelings, the observation itself was an education. She was learning how an effective ruler managed information, managed people, managed the competing demands of principle and practicality. She was also, in those years, learning the limits of what the palace system offered women like her. The formal hierarchy of the inner palace was, for most women, a ceiling. The most a consort could typically hope for was to bear the emperor a son, see that son elevated, and derive whatever influence she could from that maternal position. It was not nothing. Mother of an emperor was a position of real, if indirect, power. But it required specific biological luck, and it required everything else to go right as well. Wu seems to have understood early that conventional pathways were not going to take her anywhere interesting. The unconventional pathways were less obvious, less tested, more dangerous. But they were there. In a system as complex as the Tang imperial court, there were always gaps between the formal rules and the actual practice, and in those gaps, a sufficiently intelligent and patient person could find room to move. The 14 years she spent in the palace before Taizong's death were not, then, simply years of marking time. They were years of preparation, of learning the terrain so thoroughly that when the terrain shifted, she would know exactly which paths were available. There is a quality to this kind of patient preparation that is worth noting, because it is easy to underestimate. In a culture that tends to celebrate decisive action and visible achievement, the years of quiet learning and observation can look, from the outside, like passivity. But the capacity to wait, to defer action until the moment is genuinely right, rather than acting prematurely out of impatience or anxiety, is one of the rarest and most valuable qualities in political life. Wu Zetian had it in extraordinary measure. The years in the palace trained it, deepened it, tested it. And when the moment finally came, when Gaozong summoned her back from the convent, when the gates of the second chance opened, she was ready in a way that 14 years of conventional palace life could not have produced. She stepped through. Expanded Part 3, the emperor's favor, return from the convent, continued. The road from Ganye convent to the Chang'an palace was not long in physical distance. In historical and personal terms, it was one of the most significant short journeys in Chinese history. When Wu returned, she returned changed, not just in title or in circumstance, but in the quality of her understanding. 2 years in a Buddhist convent, whatever they may have been in terms of genuine religious experience, were 2 years of a particular kind of quiet. 2 years of observing the mechanisms of institutional life from a position of relative powerlessness. 2 years of sitting with uncertainty about the future and learning to remain steady within that uncertainty. She came back to the palace with the mental habits of someone who had sat still long enough to see clearly. Gaozong, the new emperor, was in many ways a more sympathetic figure than his father. Where Taizong had been forceful and decisive to the point of occasional brutality, Gaozong was gentler, more inclined toward consensus and deliberation. He was not weak, his military campaigns were real and significant, but he had a temperament that preferred resolution to confrontation, that sought to understand situations before acting on them. This made him, in some ways, the ideal emperor for Wu to work alongside. His preference for deliberation created space for her perspective to be included. His respect for intelligence and his genuine interest in ideas meant that Wu's intellectual abilities were valued rather than merely tolerated. And his genuine affection for her, which the historical record, even the hostile portions, confirms was real, created an emotional bond that was both personally significant and politically useful. Their relationship, in the early years of Gaozong's reign, was not simply the relationship of an emperor and a favored consort. It was, by the evidence of the decisions they made together, something more like a partnership unequal in formal terms, deeply constrained by the social structures of Tang China, but genuine in its intellectual and emotional dimensions. Wu bore him children with a regularity that demonstrates the closeness of their physical relationship. 4 sons and a daughter, over the course of roughly a decade. The children were healthy and well cared for. The sons grew up in the environment of imperial privilege and imperial expectation. The daughter, the one whose fate became the center of such controversy, lived only briefly. The political situation around Wu's return and elevation was, as we have noted, contested. But it is worth dwelling a little longer on the nature of that contestation, because it tells us something important about what Wu was actually up against. The men who opposed her elevation to Empress Chu Suiliang, Zhang Sunwuji, and the other senior ministers of the Taizong era were not simply defending abstract principles of dynastic propriety. They were defending a specific kind of political arrangement, one in which a small group of hereditary aristocrats, connected by blood and marriage to the Tang founding family, exercised decisive influence over imperial policy through their control of the most senior administrative positions. Wu's elevation threatened this arrangement in a very specific way. She was not from the highest aristocracy. She did not have blood connections to the founding families. Her power came from the emperor's personal favor, not from hereditary position or factional backing among the old aristocratic houses. A woman of her background as empress and potentially, eventually, as something more, would inevitably shift the balance of power away from the old aristocratic network and toward something more directly dependent on imperial favor and individual merit. The old ministers understood this, even if they did not say it in quite these terms. Their resistance to Wu was not only about gender or propriety. It was about power. About who would control the Tang imperial system in the decades to come. Wu understood it too. And she set about, with characteristic patience and thoroughness, changing the balance. The tools she used were not primarily dramatic ones. She did not stage a coup or make a sudden grab for power. She cultivated allies, one at a time. She identified officials whose abilities were being undervalued by the current system and created opportunities for them to demonstrate those abilities. She used the influence she had as the emperor's most trusted and most present companion to shape the appointments and promotions that gradually changed the composition of the senior official class. She was, in other words, doing exactly what any skilled political operator does, working the system from within, changing it incrementally, building the coalition that would eventually support a much larger transformation. By the time Gaozong formally declared his intention to elevate her to empress, the opposition had already been significantly weakened. Not eliminated, the confrontation with Chu Suiliang was real and sharp, but weakened enough that Gaozong's decision, despite the controversy it caused, could be carried through. The new empress took her place at the center of Tang political life. And everything changed, and kept changing, in ways that no one, not even Wu herself, could entirely predict. Expanded Part 4, The Making of an Empress, of Power Shared and Power Taken, continued. The formal powers of a Tang empress were both significant and carefully limited. She had authority over the inner palace, a vast institution with its own hierarchy of consorts, ladies-in-waiting, female officials, and eunuch servants. She presided over certain ceremonies. She was consulted on matters relating to the imperial family. She was expected to model the Confucian virtues of womanly propriety for the women of the empire. What she was not formally supposed to do was govern. The boundary between the inner palace, the women's sphere, and the outer court, the administrative sphere, was one of the most fundamental structural features of Tang imperial government. It was reinforced by physical arrangement, by legal provision, by deep cultural convention. Women belonged inside. Officials and administrative matters belonged outside. Never the two should meet. Wu dismantled this boundary over the course of roughly 2 decades, so gradually and so incrementally that by the time it was fully gone, it was almost impossible to say exactly when it had happened. The process began with Gaozong's illness. The headaches that afflicted him from the late 650s onward were, as we have noted, severe enough at their worst to prevent him from working. Someone had to read the incoming memorials when Gaozong could not. Someone had to draft the responses. The eunuchs who managed the physical passage of documents between the outer court and the inner palace became, effectively, conduits for Wu's decisions. By the 660s, the arrangement had become open enough that court observers were commenting on it. Some approved. Wu's decisions, by most accounts, were competent and in many cases perceptive. Officials who dealt with her, even those who were uncomfortable with the arrangement in principle, tended to find that she was well informed, that she had read their memorials carefully, that she asked sensible questions and gave considered answers. Some did not approve at all. Confucian political philosophy had very clear things to say about women in positions of public authority, and none of them were positive. The classics used the term hen pheasant crowing in the morning as a metaphor for a woman overstepping her proper role in political affairs, an image of disorder and ill omen. Wu knew these texts as well as any of her critics did. She had read them in that candlelit room in her father's house. She had studied them in the imperial library. And she chose, clearly and deliberately, not to be bound by them. This was not impulsive defiance. It was a reasoned position. The Confucian texts themselves contained contradictions and ambiguities that a skilled reader could exploit. They prioritized competent governance, social stability, and the welfare of the people alongside the proper ordering of social roles. Wu's implicit argument, never stated openly, always demonstrated through her actual conduct, was that she governed well, that the empire was stable and well administered under her guidance, and that these results validated what she was doing in ways that made the propriety argument secondary. She also made this argument in a specifically Confucian register. She presented herself as acting out of devotion to the dynasty, to the emperor, to the welfare of the people, all classically proper motivations. She framed her involvement in governance not as personal ambition but as duty, the duty of a devoted wife and empress to ensure that the business of the empire continued even when her husband was incapacitated. This framing was, to some degree, sincere. Wu genuinely cared about the stability of the empire. She had grown up in it, built her life in it, brought her children into it. Its welfare was her welfare. But it was also, like so much else in her political career, strategically constructed. The framing that worked politically was also the framing that allowed her to do what she believed needed doing. The expansion of her authority continued through the 670s, the period after Gaozong's health became a permanent constraint rather than an occasional one. By this point, the senior officials of the court had largely accommodated themselves to the reality of Wu's power. A new generation of ministers, men who had risen under Wu's patronage, who had never known a Tang court in which she was not a dominant presence, had replaced the old guard. The resistance was structural and ideological, embedded in the texts and traditions of Confucian governance, but it was no longer organized into effective political opposition. The two sages' formulation, Ershing, was a brilliant piece of political management. It preserved the formal primacy of the emperor while acknowledging, in an officially endorsed term, the reality of Wu's co-governance. Gaozong himself seems to have genuinely supported this formulation not as a capitulation to an overwhelming force, but as an honest description of what their partnership had become. He trusted her. He relied on her. And he was willing, more than most emperors of his era would have been, to say so. When Gaozong died in 683, after 34 years on the throne, he left behind an empire that was, by the measures available to us, in generally good order. Its institutions were functioning. Its territories were largely intact. Its population was fed, administered, defended. The costs of those 3 decades, in taxation, in military service, in the political violence that had cleared the way for Wu's dominance, were real and had been paid by real people. But the outcome was not a ruined empire. It was a going concern, handed to an empress dowager who was already, in practice, its ruler. She had prepared for this moment for 30 years. She was ready. Expanded Part 5, The Regent and the Resistance Ruling Through Sons, continued. The political violence of Wu's regency years is the part of her story that has most consistently troubled the historians who have tried to assess her legacy fairly. It was real. People died because of decisions she made. Officials were accused, tried, and executed, some of them on charges that were probably genuine, some on charges that were likely fabricated by informers using the system for personal ends, and some in circumstances so murky that the truth cannot be recovered. The context matters, though it does not eliminate the moral weight. When Wu became regent after Gaozong's death, she was operating in a political environment of genuine and serious danger. The Su Jinye Rebellion of 684, the uprising that produced Luo Binwang's famous anti-Wu manifesto, was not a symbolic gesture. It mobilized real armies in the eastern regions of the empire and was aimed explicitly at removing Wu from power and restoring what its leaders called the legitimate Tang order. Had it succeeded, Wu would very likely have been executed. After the rebellion was crushed, the question of how to prevent the next one was pressing and urgent. The answer: Wu chose an expanded surveillance system, a special investigative body with broad powers, and a policy of preemptive action against those suspected of plotting against her, was a recognizable answer. Rulers facing genuine security threats have, throughout history, used similar tools. The question is always whether the tools are calibrated appropriately to the actual threat, or whether they become, as they tend to, instruments of broader repression. In Wu's case, the honest answer is that the tools were, for a period, too broadly applied. The officials who ran the Special Investigative Bureau, men like Lai Junqian and Zhou Xing, whose names became bywords for judicial cruelty in later historical memory, appear to have used their position to pursue personal vendettas, to accept false accusations in exchange for bribes, and to extract confessions through methods that could not produce reliable information. Wu eventually moved against some of these officials themselves. Lai Junqian was arrested and eventually executed, which suggests that she recognized the system had become dysfunctional. But the damage done in the intervening years was real. Later historians, particularly those writing from a strongly Confucian perspective, have sometimes treated this period as the defining feature of Wu's rule, the proof that her governance was fundamentally tyrannical. More recent scholarship has pushed back on this framing, not to whitewash the violence but to place it in the context of comparable periods of political repression in Chinese history, including in dynasties governed entirely by men, which are not typically remembered primarily for their judicial abuses. The comparison is instructive. Tang Taizong, revered as perhaps the greatest of all Chinese emperors, had achieved the throne by killing two of his brothers and forcing his father to abdicate. The founding of the Han dynasty had been accompanied by brutal purges of meritorious officials by the first Han emperor. The political violence of Wu's regency years was not unusual in kind, only in the gender of the person who ordered it. This does not make it right. It makes it human, and specifically human in the way that power consistently is flawed, morally compromised, capable of genuine achievement and genuine harm in the same hands, sometimes on the same day. What is also true is that this period did not last forever. The acute repression of the mid-680s eased as Wu's position became more secure. Officials who had lived in fear of the informer system found, by the early 690s, that the atmosphere at court had changed, that the extreme judicial volatility of the earlier years had given way to something more stable and more predictable. This change was itself a political signal. Wu no longer needed fear as a primary governing instrument, because her authority was sufficiently established to rest on other foundations. The foundations she preferred were, in fact, the classical ones: competent administration, fair application of the law, selection of officials on the basis of merit, responsiveness to the genuine needs of the population. These are not the tools of a tyrant in the most basic sense. They are the tools of a ruler who wants a functioning state and who has enough of a stake in the functioning of that state to maintain it carefully. She issued decrees reducing taxes during floods and droughts. She ordered investigations into corrupt local officials. She expanded the school system to make examination preparation more accessible to talented young men who lacked the resources of the hereditary families. She promoted agricultural development in the southern regions of the empire, where the rich paddy field agriculture of the Yangtze River Delta was beginning its long development as the economic heart of China. These were real policies with real effects on real lives. They do not cancel the judicial abuses of the earlier period. But they are part of the same record, and any honest accounting of Wu's governance must include them alongside the darker chapters. Expanded Part 6, The Zhou Dynasty, the Woman Who Became Emperor, continued. The founding of the Zhou dynasty in 690 required Wu to solve a problem that had no precedent in Chinese political thought. The problem was legitimacy. In the Chinese political tradition, the emperor derived his authority from the mandate of heaven Tianming, a concept that held that heaven conferred the right to rule on virtuous rulers and withdrew it from those who had become corrupt or incompetent. The transitions between dynasties, the fall of the Shang, the fall of the Zhou, the fall of the Qin, the fall of the Han, and all the others, were understood as the withdrawal of the mandate from a dynasty that had failed, and its conferral on a new ruling house. The mandate was not, in this framework, inheritable in a simple biological sense. It was moral and cosmic in character. Heaven, understood not as a personal deity but as the ultimate moral order of the universe, could not be deceived or compelled. It responded to the actual quality of governance, to the welfare of the people, to the virtue of the ruler. Wu, in constructing the legitimacy of the Zhou dynasty, worked within this framework with considerable sophistication. She could not claim the hereditary family line of the Tang, she was cutting that line, at least formally. She could not simply declare herself emperor by force and expect the proclamation to stick without a more substantial legitimating narrative. What she built was a multi-layered legitimating framework that drew on different traditions simultaneously. The Buddhist argument was the most innovative. The Great Cloud Sutra prophecy about a female ruler had the merit of providing textual authority from a tradition that, unlike Confucianism, had no inherent prohibition against female leadership. Buddhism had female monks, female saints, female bodhisattvas of cosmic significance. The idea that a woman could receive a divine mandate, even cosmic authority, was not alien to Buddhist thought in the way that it was alien to Confucian thought. Wu ordered copies of the Great Cloud Sutra distributed to every prefecture in the empire, along with commentary that made the connection to her explicit. She ordered temples dedicated to the text built throughout the empire. She created a Buddhist ceremonial framework for her investiture that drew on specifically Buddhist concepts of sacral authority. This was not simply cynical manipulation of religion for political purposes, or rather, it was not only that. Wu was, by all evidence, a genuine Buddhist. She had spent 2 years in a Buddhist convent. She had a sincere practice and a sincere intellectual engagement with Buddhist philosophy. The patronage she provided to Buddhist institutions throughout her reign was on a scale that went well beyond what political calculation alone would have required. The integration of Buddhist legitimacy with imperial authority was, in some ways, her most lasting intellectual contribution to Chinese political culture, even though the Tang Restoration after her death reversed many of its specific institutional expressions. She also drew on the Confucian tradition, strategically but not dishonestly. She pointed to her decades of actual governance, the evidence that the empire had been well run, that the people were fed and defended, that the institutions functioned. In purely Confucian terms, this was the most compelling argument. The mandate of heaven was demonstrated by the actual condition of the realm, and the condition of the realm under her management was, by the measures that mattered, good. She cultivated the image of a ruler in the classical mode, holding court, listening to officials, reading memorials, performing the great ritual sacrifices. She dressed in the full imperial ceremonial regalia, including the 12-symbol robe that had been worn only by male emperors before. She insisted on the full formal protocol, the prostrations, the titles, the ceremony that confirmed the status of the ruler as something categorically different from all other human beings. The court accepted this. Not unanimously, not without private reservations among officials who were convinced that female rulership was cosmically wrong but who were also convinced that survival required accommodation. But it accepted it. The machinery of the empire continued to function. The armies patrolled the frontiers. The granaries were filled and distributed. The examination halls opened on schedule. Life, for most people in the empire, went on. And in the divine capital, in the vast ceremonial spaces of Luoyang's palace complex, the woman who had been a Karanu at 14 and a convicted impossible thing at 65 sat at the center of it all, reading the day's memorials, making the day's decisions, carrying the weight of an empire on shoulders that had been preparing for exactly this for as long as she could remember. Expanded Part 7, The Court of the Divine Capital Governance, Culture, and the Examination System, continued. The examination halls of the Tang dynasty were strange, demanding, and in their own way, beautiful places. Imagine a long hall of individual cells, each one barely large enough to contain a man sitting at a small desk. The cells were open at the front, so that proctors could walk the aisles and ensure that no communication passed between candidates. Each candidate entered with his writing materials and a small lamp. He would be there for 3 days, sometimes longer, composing essays, writing poems in specified forms, demonstrating his mastery of the classical texts and his ability to apply them to practical questions of governance and ethics. The examinations were designed to be genuinely hard. The pass rate was low, sometimes under 10%. Men could and did spend decades taking the examinations without succeeding. They composed their essays in highly stylized forms that required not just knowledge of the content but mastery of a demanding literary tradition. The highest examination, the Jinshi, or presented scholar, was the most prestigious qualification in Chinese civilization, a credential that opened doors unavailable by any other means. Under Wu's expansions of the examination system, several things changed. First, the volume of candidates increased substantially. Wu encouraged men from a wider range of social backgrounds to take the examinations, and her administrative reforms made it somewhat more possible for talented men without wealthy or aristocratic family connections to prepare adequately. The number of men who sat the examinations in the 690s and early 700s was larger than in previous decades. Second, the palace examination, the special examination conducted in the capital for candidates who had already passed the regular examinations, became a significant institution. Wu presided over some of these examinations personally, which was an extraordinary departure from convention. An emperor personally selecting officials through written examination, based on the quality of their work rather than their connections or their family background, was a powerful statement about the basis of authority and the criteria for service. Third, Wu created examination categories for military service, expanding the merit-based recruitment system beyond the civil administration into the military sphere. This had practical implications for the quality of Tang military leadership, and it helped develop a culture of professional military service that was somewhat less dependent on the hereditary aristocratic networks that had traditionally dominated the upper ranks of the army. These reforms were not without critics. The old aristocratic families, the great clans of the northern plains, saw the expanding examination system as a threat to their traditional dominance of official positions. They had always had advantages in the examinations, the resources to hire tutors, the family libraries of classical texts, the social networks that smoothed the path from examination success to official appointment. But the expansion of the system, and Wu's explicit favoritism toward talented men of lower social origin, put genuine pressure on these advantages. The cultural consequence of this political choice was significant. As the official class became somewhat more diverse in its social origins, the culture it produced also became somewhat more diverse. The poets who flourished at Wu's court came from a wider range of backgrounds than had been typical in earlier Tang courts. The subjects they wrote about, the experiences they drew on, the emotional registers they worked in, all of this was broadened by the broadening of the social base from which culture producers were drawn. Chen Zian, whose poetry is among the finest of the era, had a complicated relationship with Wu's court. He served as an official, was imprisoned at one point, was eventually released. His most famous poem, On a Tower at Yuzhou, is a meditation on solitude and the weight of time. A man standing on an ancient tower, seeing nothing behind him but the ages of the past and nothing before him but the long future, and feeling, in the gap between those two immensities, utterly alone. It is a poem that could have been written in any period. But there is something about the court environment of Wu's era, the combination of extraordinary cultural vitality and acute political tension, the sense of living in a time of tremendous historical significance, that seems to have made that particular kind of solitary clarity available in a special way. Wu herself was a poet. Some of her compositions survive official ceremonial verse, for the most part, written in the elaborate regulated forms required by court convention. They are competent, sometimes more than competent. They show a person who genuinely understood what poetry was trying to do, even when the formal occasion constrained what it could actually do. There is one poem attributed to her, and the attribution is uncertain, as it is for much of what she supposedly wrote, that describes the first blooming of a certain flower in the imperial garden. The flower opens in winter, defying the cold and the snow. The poem notes this fact without metaphor, without obvious allegorical application, but with a quality of quiet attention that reads, centuries later, like a person noticing something true about the world and finding it worth recording. Whether she wrote it or not, the poem has been carried in her name for a very long time. That too seems right, somehow. Expanded Part 8, The Frontiers of Empire, War, Diplomacy, and the Edges of the Known World, continued. The Silk Road was not, in the late 7th century, a simple or well-understood thing. It was not a single road but a network of routes, shifting and branching across the deserts and mountains between China and the Mediterranean world. Different routes were viable in different seasons, after different rainfall years, depending on the political stability of the oasis states through which they passed. The merchants who used these routes, Sogdian traders above all, those extraordinary Central Asian middlemen who linked the economies of China and Persia and Byzantium, were themselves a kind of political force, their presence and their prosperity dependent on the maintenance of stable conditions along the routes they traveled. When Tang armies controlled the oasis cities of Central Asia, Turfan, Kutcha, Khotan, Kashgar, the Silk Road was open and active. When Tibetan or Turkic pressure closed those routes, the flow of commerce contracted, the revenues of the Tang western outposts declined, and the cosmopolitan energy of Chang'an and Luoyang felt, slightly, the change. Wu understood this connection between military control at the frontiers and economic vitality in the interior. The recapture of the 4 garrisons of Anxi in 692, the fortified Tang positions in the Darim Basin that had been lost to Tibetan expansion in the 670s, was celebrated not only as a military achievement but as an economic and symbolic one. The Tang was back in Central Asia. The roads were open. The general who accomplished this, Wang Xiajie, was one of several military commanders who rose during Wu's reign through exactly the meritocratic process she had promoted. He was not from the old aristocratic military families. He had risen through the examination system and through demonstrated ability in the field. His success in Central Asia was, in a small way, a validation of the principle that talent, wherever it was found, was the empire's best resource. The diplomacy of Wu's era was equally complex and equally active. The Tang imperial court maintained diplomatic relationships with dozens of states, ranging from the Korean kingdom of Silla to the Arab caliphate that was rapidly expanding westward and northward from Arabia in the mid-7th century. The first contact between the Tang Empire and the Islamic world occurred during this period, Arab ambassadors arriving in Chang'an, Tang officials traveling westward and encountering the expanding Umayyad Empire. These encounters were managed through the Tang tributary system, a sophisticated framework for handling foreign relationships that was neither purely diplomatic in the modern sense nor purely imperial. States that accepted tributary status acknowledged the theoretical primacy of the Tang emperor in the hierarchy of civilizations, sent periodic missions with gifts, and received in return gifts of recognition, trade access, and in some cases military protection. The system was flexible enough to accommodate many different actual political relationships within its formal hierarchy. Wu used the tributary system with considerable skill. She understood that prestige, the projection of Tang cultural and political authority, was a genuine strategic resource, and she managed it carefully. The receptions she organized for foreign embassies in Luoyang were elaborate and calculated affairs, designed to impress visitors with the scale and sophistication of Tang civilization. Foreign ambassadors who attended court during Wu's reign and who left accounts of their experience describe a government of extraordinary complexity and efficiency, presided over by a woman whose authority was visible in every room she entered. The Japanese missions of this era deserve particular mention. Japan, in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, was in the process of constructing a centralized imperial state, a process in which Tang institutions served as the primary model. Japanese missions to the Tang court during Wu's reign brought back not just Buddhist texts and artistic techniques but legal codes, administrative structures, architectural designs, and writing systems that were adapted to create the foundations of Japanese civilization as it would develop over the following centuries. The capital city of Nara, built in the early 8th century in Japan, was a deliberate recreation of Chang'an laid out on the same grid plan, organized around the same principles of hierarchical spatial arrangement, oriented toward the same cardinal directions. The Tang influence on Japanese culture during this period was so profound and so comprehensive that it is difficult to imagine Japanese civilization as it actually developed without it. Wu's court was the Tang court that the Japanese missions knew best. The model of governance, culture, and civilization they brought back to Japan was, in significant part, the model of a civilization at its peak under her direction. The empresses and female rulers of early Japan, women like Empress Suko and Empress Jito, who presided over the critical decades of Japanese state formation, were making their decisions in the same period that Wu was making hers. Whether there was direct influence, whether the Japanese courts were aware of Wu's example and drew inspiration from it, is not entirely clear from the sources. But the parallel is real, and it is worth noting, in the same historical moment, women were governing two of the great civilizations of East Asia. that fact has not always received the attention it deserves. Expanded Part 9, The World She Made, Women, Society, and the Tang Cultural Moment, continued. The Tang dynasty's relative openness toward women is visible in the archaeology as well as in the texts. The tomb figures, the famous Tang Sankai pottery sculptures that have been excavated from Tang-era graves across northern China include, in remarkable numbers, female figures with an extraordinary specificity of character and expression. These are not generic ornamental objects. They are portraits of particular types of people: women on horseback, women with musical instruments, women in the elaborate headdresses of court fashion, women in the practical riding clothes of the polo field. Some have Central Asian features, a reminder of the cosmopolitan world in which Tang women of the upper classes moved. What strikes a modern observer about these figures is their vitality. They are not passive. They are in motion, or poised for motion. The horsewoman has the posture of someone who rides well and knows it. The polo player's attention is directed at something outside the frame of the sculpture, something that matters and is moving and requires her full focus. These are not images of women defined entirely by their relationship to men. They are images of women with their own competencies, their own pleasures, their own presence in the world. This is, of course, an upper-class perspective. The Tang Sankai figures represent the experience of the elite. The lives of peasant women, women in the countryside, women doing the hard physical labor of the agricultural cycle, these lives are much less visible in the historical record, and there is little reason to think that the relative social openness of Tang elite culture extended in a consistent way to women across all social classes. But the elite culture matters, for a specific reason. It is the culture that was reproduced, imitated, and eventually spread. The norms of elite Tang culture, including its relative acceptance of women in public space, on horseback, in intellectual conversation, influenced the expectations and the self-understanding of women in the social classes that aspired to elite status. And those norms were shaped, in part, by the fact that the most powerful person in the empire for several decades was a woman. Wu's specific influence on the situation of women at her court was more direct in some areas. She appointed women to official positions within the palace administrative structure, not just honorary titles but genuine working roles managing aspects of the court's complex operation. She patronized female scholars and female artists. She created a context in which female intelligence and female competence were recognized and rewarded rather than merely tolerated. The implications of this for how women understood their own possibilities, even in a period and a culture that officially defined those possibilities very narrowly, are difficult to quantify but real. A woman who saw other women managing complex administrative work, handling documents of state, being consulted on matters of substance, was living in a different mental world than a woman who saw only the conventional picture of female seclusion and subordination. These were not revolutionary changes. They did not challenge the fundamental Confucian framework of women's subordination. But they were real improvements in the conditions of women's lives, made by a ruler who understood, from her own experience, that the formal rules and the lived reality of women's existence in China were not always the same thing, and that the gaps between them mattered. The cultural legacy of Wu's era includes one more dimension worth dwelling on: the architecture. Luoyang under Wu was a city of extraordinary architectural ambition. She built and rebuilt on a scale that transformed the ancient Eastern capital into something genuinely new, a city that expressed, in stone and wood and tile, the vision of a civilization at its most confident and most creative. The Mingtang, the Hall of Enlightened Rule, was perhaps the most audacious of her construction projects. It was a colossal structure, roughly square in plan, rising to a height of several stories, surmounted by an elaborate roof and crowned with a golden phoenix. Its design drew on ancient ritual specifications for the Mingtang that had been debated by scholars for centuries, the ideal ceremonial hall in which the emperor performed the rituals that confirmed his connection to the cosmic order. Wu built a version of this structure that was both a genuinely functional ceremonial space and a declaration of confidence in the legitimacy and permanence of her rule. The Mingtang burned down and was rebuilt. The specific building she constructed does not survive. But the energy that went into building it, the thousands of workers, the careful design process, the enormous material investment, tells us something about how Wu understood the relationship between physical space and political authority. The buildings she erected were arguments made in stone and timber, assertions of sovereignty and legitimacy that could be seen and touched and inhabited. In this, she was deeply continuous with the tradition of Chinese imperial architecture. Every great dynasty built monuments to its own legitimacy. What was different was that the person commissioning these monuments was a woman, which meant that every building was also a slightly radical statement about who could command such things to be built. Expanded Part 10, The End of an Empire, the Qianlong Coup and the Return of Tang, continued. The last years of Wu's reign have a quality, in the historical sources, of slow unwinding, a great power gradually releasing its hold, not in a sudden dramatic collapse but in the patient, inevitable way that seasons change. By 700, Wu was governing from an increasingly private space. She had moved much of her daily life to the secluded inner sections of the Luoyang Palace complex, the gardens and pavilions where she received visitors in smaller, more intimate settings rather than the great ceremonial halls of state. The morning courts still met. Officials still brought their memorials. The machinery of the empire still turned. But the person at its center was more physically remote, more dependent on the mediation of those around her. The Zhang brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, were the most visible of these mediators. They had come to Wu's attention in the late 690s, introduced by a niece of Wu's who seems to have recognized that the aging empress was increasingly in need of personal companionship that was not complicated by political calculation. The Zhang brothers were young, charming, and apparently not particularly interested in governance. They brought music, conversation, physical company to the private world of an old woman who had spent her entire life in the relentless complexity of political existence. The brothers themselves do not appear to have been particularly corrupt in the most straightforward sense. They were not running systematic bribery operations or building up enormous personal fortunes. But they were careless, and they were indiscreet, and they had the particular kind of arrogance that can grow in young men who find themselves, through luck rather than merit, at the center of extraordinary events. They made enemies. Among those enemies were some of the most senior officials in the empire, men who had served Wu loyally for decades, who had helped build the Zhou dynasty, who had made peace with female rulership because of their genuine respect for Wu's ability. These men tolerated the Zhang brothers with increasing difficulty, and they watched the deterioration of the formal governing arrangements with growing alarm. The decision to move against the brothers, and, in effect, to force the end of the Zhou dynasty and restore the Tang, was not taken lightly or quickly. It involved careful coalition building among the senior officials, consultation with the Crown Prince Li Xian, the future Zhangzong, Wu's son, who had been quietly restored to the role of heir apparent a few years earlier, and a precise assessment of the military resources that would be needed to carry out the coup successfully. The men who executed the Qianlong coup, Zhang Jianji, Cui Shanwei, Jing Hui, Yuan Shuji, and Huan Yanfan were not enemies of Wu in any personal sense. Most of them had served her for years. They were men of the Tang tradition who believed, ultimately, that the Tang dynasty had to be restored, that whatever Wu had achieved, the dynasty should pass back to the Li family rather than entering the further uncertainty of a Zhou succession that had no clear solution. The coup itself was swift and, in the circumstances, relatively bloodless. Only the two Zhang brothers died. Wu was confronted with the reality of the situation and asked to step aside. She complied. The decision to comply deserves more attention than it usually receives. Wu was 80 years old. She was ill. She was in the deepest interior of her palace. The men with the imperial guards at their back had the physical power to compel whatever they wanted. Resistance, in any conventional military sense, was not available to her. But capitulation was not the same as defeat. Wu's response to the coup was, characteristically, measured. She acknowledged the officials who had come. She agreed to the transfer of power. She insisted on certain dignities. She was to remain empress, to be treated with the respect due the grandmother of the imperial house, to be housed appropriately. These conditions were accepted. She had spent a lifetime negotiating. Even at the end, she negotiated. The months between the coup and her death were spent in the Shenyang Palace, a quiet, comfortable, well-staffed residence in the Luoyang Palace complex, set in gardens that the records describe as pleasant and well-tended. She received visits from family members. She was attended by the servants and physicians appropriate to her rank. She was treated, the sources agree, with genuine respect. Emperor Zhongzong, her son Li Xian, now restored, visited her in the palace. The sources describe these visits as tender, even affectionate, between a mother and a son navigating a complicated history with whatever grace they could manage. She died in the 11th month of 705. The season would have been late autumn in central China, the time when the trees are finally bare and the air carries the first sharp edge of the coming winter. The leaves of the palace gardens would have been mostly fallen by then, lying in drifts along the garden walls. She was given imperial burial rites, buried beside Gaozong at the Qianling Mausoleum, in the tomb that had been prepared for them both, as was customary for an imperial couple. The mountain above the tomb rises in a distinctive silhouette against the sky that has not changed in 14 centuries. And the blank stele was erected. Smooth. Silent. Waiting for whatever history would choose to say. History chose to say many things, as we have noted. It spoke through hostile Confucian historians and sympathetic popular novelists. Through the Buddhist monks who honored her patronage and the Confucian scholars who condemned her transgression. Through the women of later centuries who knew her story and found in it something that resonated beyond what the official condemnation could fully suppress. Through the modern historians who have tried to read the sources with fresh eyes and see the human being rather than the legend. All of this speaking, across 14 centuries, on a surface that she left blank on purpose. There is something almost unbearably eloquent about that choice. Closing meditation, expanded and deepened. The night is very quiet now. Somewhere in Shanxi province, where the Wei River makes its long curve through the lush plain before joining the Yellow River, the stars are out above the dry hills. The same stars that were out 14 centuries ago, when a girl in a candlelit room in a prosperous household was just beginning to understand the world and her place in it. She could not have known, that girl, what the stars above her head were holding in their cold and patient light. She could not have known that the words she was learning to read by candlelight, the old histories, the classic texts, the poems of earlier dynasties, were giving her something that no one could take away from her. Not a fortune, not a title. Something more durable than those. A way of understanding the world. A set of tools for thinking about what was happening and what might happen and what might be possible. Let your breath slow now, if it hasn't already. Feel the weight of your body, the heaviness of it, settling into the surface beneath you. That settling feeling is rest beginning. That is the body letting go of the day, the way a hand lets go of something it has been holding for a long time. Wu Zetian's story is, among other things, a story about patience. About the long preparation that precedes the decisive moment. About the years of careful watching that make possible a single clear act of understanding. Most lives are lived in those years of watching and waiting. The dramatic moments, the throne rooms, the proclamations, the great ceremonies are very brief, compared to the long ordinary texture of days. The candlelit reading. The slow walk through a palace garden in the early morning when no one else is about. The cup of tea in a quiet room, and outside the window, the world continuing its enormous indifferent business. Wu Zetian's life contained all of that ordinary texture, beneath the extraordinary events. She had mornings when she was tired and evenings when she was uncertain. She had days when the machinery of the empire felt too large and too complicated to manage, and days when a single well-written memorial from a capable official felt like a small perfect gift. She had, almost certainly, moments of doubt about the choices she had made. No one who has made the kinds of choices she made, choices with real consequences for real people, choices where the cost was paid by others as well as by herself, could have been entirely without doubt. What she appears to have had, alongside the doubt, was a remarkable steadiness. A quality of continuing, of moving forward, of making the next decision, of not being paralyzed by the weight of everything that had gone before or everything that might go wrong. That steadiness is its own kind of achievement. Perhaps, in the end, the most genuinely admirable one. Let your thoughts drift now. Not away from what you've heard tonight, let it stay, in the quiet way that things stay when they've been absorbed rather than just encountered. The smell of incense in a stone courtyard. The sound of bronze bells, deep and resonant, in the chest. The smooth surface of a blank steel, worn by weather and by centuries of wondering hands. These are not just images of the past. They are textures of a world that was as real as the room you are in now, as real as the warmth of the blankets, the particular quality of the darkness, the sound of your own slow breathing. History is always this close. It lives in the things we have inherited, the institutions, the ideas, the ways of organizing power and knowledge and beauty that were built by people who had mornings and evenings and uncertainties and steadiness just like ours. Wu Zetian built some of those things. The examination halls that shaped Chinese governance for 1,000 years after her death. The stone faces carved from living rock above the Yi River. The cultural moment that produced poems still read by hundreds of millions of people. The simple, persistent, undeniable fact of having done the impossible thing. The blank steel is still there. The mountain above the tomb rises in its familiar silhouette. The stars above Shanxi are the same stars. And you are here, in this quiet moment, at the end of a long journey through time. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your breathing find its own rhythm, slow and slower. There is nothing you need to do or decide or understand right now. The world will continue its vast and patient turning. The histories will keep their long accounts. For now, there is only this, the warmth, and the darkness, and the deep, reliable quiet of a mind beginning to rest. Sleep well. Sleep slowly. You have come a long way tonight, and you are exactly where you need to be. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.